Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We hope you're keeping very, very safe and well. Thank you ever so much for joining us. It is the afternoon of the evening from before, if that quite makes sense. We are recording day after the Manchester City game. And back with yet another Last Word on Spurs special to bring to you. If you're listening to the show for the first time, you can find us on iTunes. We're on Spotify, across all major audio platforms. We are, of course, on Twitter at Last Word on Spurs. We're on Facebook and Instagram too. And before we introduce our special guest joining us for this one, delighted to have back alongside me, I've got Mr. Lee McQueen. Macca, was it been 8-9 hours since I've last saw you?
Don't tell everyone that, Rick. People are starting with rumours.
Macca, I'm seeing you. Well, I'm seeing you more than I see my wife right now. I think she's more delighted than me.
Hello. It was weird actually. I see the press conference with Antonio Conte. I don't know, Dan, if you were there today on that. But he rolled up in the morning. It was so weird. We only played last night and we've got a press conference already. It's very strange. So we feel a little bit like that this afternoon. But absolutely delighted to be back talking the troubles that we've got at Tottenham. Let's be honest, there's a lot of unrest and there's a lot of stuff going on with the club right now. And we need 3 points. We need 3 points on Monday. And we also need some new faces coming into the football club in terms of players. So let's see what we can do. But I'm very excited to have Dan on with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Vass was with us last night. I was in the comments there, and Vass probably thinks we've stayed on for the last 9 hours. We haven't, Vass, I promise you. We've had some form of sleep. Yeah, I know one man who hasn't had much sleep, bringing him back on. He was in Manchester last night, so very, very late. Made his journey back this morning. We've got the brilliant Dan Kilpatrick from the Evening Standard. Dan, love to have you back on Last One on Spurs. Quiet week, Dan?
You could say that, yeah. And I think a shout out to anyone who's listening now, because to have the energy to still be consuming Spurs content on a Friday afternoon after last night, ahead of a free weekend where I think we could kind of all do with a weekend away from Spurs. I think it's a blessing that it's a Monday night game for a number of reasons. So yeah, fair play to anyone who's still getting their fix. But yeah, it's been a pretty draining week, and I think for everyone kind of connected with Spurs, be it supporter or reporter, I think it's a pretty glum time to be following the club at the moment. And as Lee says, yeah, we could do some good news on Monday night and in the transfer market in the next 12 days.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, always, I mean, it feels at the moment, where do you even start with what's going on at the football club? You know, from the board to the manager, to the players, to the window. It just feels like at the moment, invariably when we're doing our post-match analysis shows, that the shows are just being completely derailed by just what is going on in and around the football club at the moment, which is why, Dan, it's nice to have you on to maybe just understand a little bit deeper as to what's been happening. I mean, like I said, Dan, I made that joke. It's been a quiet week for you. It probably has been the complete polar opposite. It's, I think it's a testing week for everybody around the football club, fans, journalists, anybody that's connected to the football club right now. It is really, really tough. I think we can't forget that, you know, ultimately we all do want the same thing. We all want the club to be successful. We maybe all of us have a different view as to how we can be successful, but ultimately that is what we all want. I think it's important that message does not get lost at all whatsoever. So, Dan, I know obviously this week, or maybe in the previous couple of weeks, you wrote a couple of articles that have seemed to have stirred some headlines. So just to maybe give you the opportunity, Dan, to maybe take the floor and maybe give us a bit of a viewpoint from your end as to those articles, how they've been received and what you'd like to say on them, maybe to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, so to be clear, I chatted to you last night and I said, I'm umming and ahhing about whether to address it because people may or may not know. I wrote a piece earlier in the week. It was about what Conte and Spurs should do, or what I believe they should do in order to make the partnership work. And one paragraph in particular really angered a lot of people when I said Conte should compromise on transfer target. Well, I said Conte would have to compromise on some transfer targets, was the way I put it. And then to paraphrase what I wrote, I also said he needed to kind of accept he was at a top club and stop talking Spurs down. And I had a lot of comments about this piece. People saying I was kind of parroting club lines, people saying I was a shill for ENIC, people saying I was being employed by Daniel Levy. There was even one kind of brave blogger, anonymous blogger, obviously, who said I was a messenger for Levy and that I was insinuated that I was being paid by the club. And I had a lot of comments. I had a lot of emails, which I don't normally get. So I was quite taken aback. I don't mind saying I was pretty surprised. I stand by the piece and everything I wrote. And I'm not sure where to start really with this. I suppose a good place to start is to say that I think a lot of the people kind of saying that myself and other reporters are parroting club lines and being paid by the club. I think they probably think they're being very clever, but actually this betrays a serious misunderstanding about our jobs and also how the club and most clubs operate. I mean, I don't know any clubs that kind of actively brief against their own manager, just as a starting point. I mean, I think Spurs don't brief against their manager for the same reason that a janitor wouldn't shit on the floor where they work, because the club would then have a mess of their own making, which they'd have to clean up. So this doesn't tend to happen. And in 7 years covering Spurs, the club's never picked up the phone to me and said, "Oh, I've got a bit of, we need to tell you something about the manager," or so and so's not happy. It just doesn't happen. Of course, you have relationships with these people. Sometimes they'll tell you something, a nugget of information. You might use that in your reporting, or you might save it for future pieces or whatever. But it just doesn't happen that a club will kind of brief you against their own employees. So I think that was the accusation. People might also say, well, you're just writing what the club want to hear because you want to stay in their favour and you want access, which is a more logical argument. But I mean, again, I would kind of ask what access. I mean, the last kind of exclusive interview I did with the club was Lloris, and to give you an idea of when that was, it was when Spurs was still unbeaten under Nuno. So it's not as if the club are kind of.
Did you have Nuno, Dan? Did Nuno manage the football club?
It's easy to forget. And most of the stuff that's not to say the club are bad with me in any way. It's just to give you it's not as if there's a really reciprocal relationship where we're giving them positive coverage and they're doing us massive favors. Most of the stuff I get in terms of quotes will be from the mix zone, like an interview I did with Lloris last night, or press conferences which are open to all media. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of set the record straight, really, and I appreciate there are people that won't believe me or whatever, but what I wrote was kind of sincerely my opinion. You can disagree with that opinion, and that's why we all love the game, right? Because it is a game of opinions and it sparks debate, and that's why I enjoy doing my job. But I hope people will kind of sincerely acknowledge that what I write is how I see the situation in honestly, and not kind of what I've been told to write by the club or what I think they want to hear. And yeah, I mean, and then I'd be more than happy to kind of get into the details of what I wrote. Again,
shall we then, Dan? I mean, look, I think I hear you. I mean, there's a lot of comments in the section about.
Can I say one thing, Lee, just to carry on? It's funny because on Dan's point he makes there, there's also been that accusation in the last few days that apparently me and you, Lee, are also being paid by the club. Now, if the club was paying me, you can probably hear my 2-year-old right now that is shouting down the kitchen next to me here. So I'm not too sure how much the club would be interested in hearing my 2-year-old son shout down and scream the place down and pay me at the same time I'm doing Last Word on Spurs. But I just want to make it very, very clear. Yes, Last Word on Spurs is sponsored by Beavertown Brewery, but we are not being censored or not being told to change or shift our opinion whatsoever. I think what we've always tried to do on Last Word on Spurs is provide a logical balance as to where things stand. Some feel maybe that we're not ballsy enough, but on numerous occasions and throughout the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 shows, we have been heavily critical of the board. And many of us have suggested coming onto the show that there needs to be communication. There needs to be some form of a change for the club to be successful. So I'm just not quite sure what people would want us to do or to say when we're just trying to be honest and be logical about our approach, Lee. I don't even want to come back on that, Lee, before you carry on.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that some of the comments that they're making me laugh today. So, Ash is saying the club will want a refund if they're paying us to do this stuff. I agree with you, Ash. I totally agree with you. Look, I personally think, it was quite tough yesterday to come on and talk about the defeat in the manner that it happened. and then it quickly turns to, and this is no one's fault, this is just where the fan base is divided, or where the fan base is. Everybody seems to want to be either left or right. Everybody wants to see either red or blue. Everyone needs to be in, out, in. That's not actually the case. What the case is that what we need is to take on different bits of information and then make our own minds up. And if my mind is actually, I want the board to invest 500 million pounds in the summer, and I don't think they're doing a good enough job, then that's my opinion. But also, if my opinion is I think they've done an amazing job with the infrastructure of the club and where they are and what they're doing, and actually it's a matter of time before they invest, then that's also my opinion. And thirdly, if my opinion is this is an absolute disgrace, 23 years of like one trophy, then that's also my opinion. So I do get it from all angles. I think the bit that I start to draw the line at is where it starts to get like quite aggressive and attacking. Just because of a person's opinion, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that they're bad blokes or bad individuals, bad girls. It doesn't mean that. It means that we just have a difference of opinion. Like I know a lot of my best friends are Arsenal fans, right? And we obviously clash from an Arsenal Tottenham fan, but it doesn't mean to say that we don't like each other or we don't have to be aggressive to each other. I'm sure people vote in a different way. I'm sure people have different religions. Do you see what I mean? So, but I think the overriding problem is, that we don't hear enough from the board. So the communication from the board is just basically silenced. And then people wrongly, because we know that we're not paid by the club or mouthpieces of the club, but people wrongly then accuse people of being their mouthpieces because they're not hearing from the club. So I do get the frustration. I totally get it. But equally, from a media standpoint, or from a, I'm not in media, obviously. I'm just lucky enough to do something that I love, although it is quite hard when people are not loving it as it is at the moment. But I love to be on the Last Word on Spurs, and I'll just give my honest opinion. Like, I'll do a match analysis or a post-match analysis, and I'll see the game as it is, how I see it in my eyes, and I look at the club as an overall situation. And just because some people don't agree with that or wholeheartedly agree with that, or vice versa, it doesn't mean to say that we should be attacked. So that would be my piece on it. But I think the overriding factor is that something needs to change in the football club, right? Mm-hmm. Something has to change, because let's be honest, lads, viewers, listeners, we have been here so many times, and the one common denominator, let's have it right, is the football club, is the board, right? In that scenario. So I'm not necessarily saying in or out. What I'm saying is something needs to change. And we need to find a way together, and that is the board, the management, the directors, the recruitment team, the directors of football, the fans, the journalists, the podcasters, if we can call ourselves that, Rick. We need to find a way of coming together, because that's how we're going to get success. And it is so fragmented at the moment. It's tough. It's hard to work it through. But I would rather sit and talk and debate and work it through rather than be aggressive on it. And I think that's where I start to draw the line. Does that make sense?
I think that you've made loads of good points there, Lee, if I can just jump in. I mean, first of all, obviously it would be fantastic if Spurs were paying, if Spurs said, you can have 5% of Ndombele's salary then I would have I have a big decision to make. It would be very tempting, but sadly that's not the case. But look, I think in all seriousness, you made some great points, Lee, and I think, first of all, you're right. It's not black and white. It's a nuanced situation. And again, I'm happy to talk about, some of my feelings about Conte and how he's not helping the situation or sort of contributing to the malaise. And also the comment about communication from the board. I couldn't agree more. Conte himself called them out on it, or he didn't actually call them out. And he said English footballers. He called out English football on it, to be clear, this week. And I think they don't help themselves. And I think if Levy, frankly, did an interview with independent media every 6 months and said, listen, this is what I'm trying to do, this is my position on this, it would make a big difference. Instead, he doesn't do any interviews really, and he does an annual message once a year before the last home game of the season, which is heavily PR'd.
It's that lack of connection, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, and frankly, I was saying this to a mate the other day. the club won't like to hear this, but the only other kind of public figure I know who doesn't do interviews and communicates once a year through an annual message was the Queen. Why is Levy behaving like the Queen of England? It's absurd. They should be accountable to supporters and be a lot more open and communicative, I think.
Dan, there's so much to touch upon. What we are going to do is, look, we'll get your thoughts on City, and then that will probably lead into, like I say, there's nothing that's off limits here again. We are going to mentally go back through, the situation with the players, the board, potential transfers. Let's start with last night. I feel like this has just been a continuation, Lee, of just what is going on right now. But we'll come to Dan. We'll then go to you, Macca. I feel like we're just going back over old ground with last night. But I have to get your thoughts on it, Dan. Look, last night, 4 goals against us, 4 errors. I feel like we've been here before. I have got a horrible feeling, no doubt we might be there again under this current situation when we find ourselves with this particular group of players. You were there, Dan, obviously reporting for obviously in your role. What was your thoughts of the overall performance and result up at the Etihad?
Well, I thought it was particularly frustrating because in the first half, I thought there were real kind of green shoots, and it was a kind of reminder that there's a bit of life in this Conte team yet, I think. I thought there was obviously a game plan. It wasn't the exact game plan of last year. I think that would be unfair. I think it was a bit braver. It was kind of more of a high-pressing game plan, which you saw for the first goal with Bentancur really getting up to Rodri. And I think the players executed it really well. And it was a kind of reminder of Spurs when they looked like a well-coached, well-drilled team that were following the manager's instructions to the letter. And lots of tactical fouls, lots of commitment. I enjoyed it. It was like watching Spurs in the second half of last season. So that made it particularly frustrating that essentially they gifted City 4 goals. I thought it was 4 errors or 4 really sloppy pieces of play. Perisic and Lloris for the first 3 more or less, and then Longley for the 4th. That speaks to the kind of lack of quality, the lack of belief in the side. As soon as Alvarez scored, I thought Spurs were going to cave. They're so poor at responding to setbacks. I think that is an issue that possibly points to a kind of lack of belief and a lack of buy-in to the project. Whether the fact that Conte is not committing until beyond the end of the season, is a factor. I don't know, but it looked like a side who, as soon as they suffer a bit of adversity, they just crumble. We've seen it before, and I think, as you said, we will probably see it again. But my overall takeaway was that there's still a decent team in there that can play Conte's way, and they did for 45 minutes, having Bentancur and Kulusevski back to near their best. It was a reminder that there are quality players in this team. But my piece for the Evening Standard today was about the defence, and you look at the quality back there and the way they're playing, and it's kind of very hard to see how Conte builds on that when the confidence and kind of quality is as low as it is. So that's we can get into that, but it's an issue, isn't it? And there's not many. It's not like there's many good options for him to change it, unless he maybe goes to a back 4.
It really is. If I could just interact there, if I may, Rick. So I think, again, makes some really good points, Dan. I think that I don't want to go on my take on the City game. So I did an hour and a half on that last night, and people are just going to switch off because my dulcet tones. But what I would say is, sad as I am, during my lunch break earlier, I watched Antonio Conte's presser twice because I like to see the body language and the understanding of, like, it's not just a quote. Yesterday I snapped at you, Rick, didn't I, about the quote bit, what he said about the defenders. But actually, when you watch his press conference, it is different when you watch it with the words. And obviously, being there, Dan, as you are most of the time, is obviously you get a better context. And so I watched his one for the preview of Fulham, which was weird because it was on this morning, and he was talking about that the lack of he didn't actually say the lack of defensive options, but he was talking quite heavily about the fact that we did press high and we did take risks and we were braver. And I, for one, it's just my opinion, I could see that in the first half without a doubt. It looked like, I sent a WhatsApp group, didn't I, yesterday? Wow, we look like you're pressing. Kane's even Kane's given it a go to press, which, there's been a bit of a long running joke that you can't press as much as you could anymore. But, we were pressing. But what we wasn't doing very well as a team is doing it as a team, like as a unit, that intensity press, which maybe we've got a hangover from, or maybe we're a bit used to under Pochettino. But that one time that the press worked, we scored. And Bentancur was a classic example of that. It was very strong. So there's no doubt in my mind, in your mind, your piece today, everybody talking that our defence is the issue. And I just wonder, there was a disgraceful 3-0 defeat at the Etihad a couple of seasons ago when Sanchez fell on his face. I don't want to be rude to Sanchez, but he fell on his face, right? It was just calamitous. And the fourth goal yesterday was the same with Longley. I mean, Longley is a completely different defender to Sanchez. And yes, he didn't fall on his face, but it was still calamitous, wasn't it? It was just individual errors time and time again. And I think one thing that I got out of Conte's presser today was he was trying to explain a process, and there's some really good questions. Obviously, I think the Moose was in there asking the question that he talked about quite heavily, Ian Abrahams, and he spoke about, in a process, sometimes you have to go forward, but go backwards, but it still looks like progress. Like you've just alluded to there, Dan, we played better as a team, as a unit against City yesterday than we did last season. Yet we won last season, and this season we lost, or last night that we lost. So he was trying to explain that progress isn't just about winning and results all the time. Progress is learning about certain situations, which I get, and I want him to succeed at Tottenham. I want Antonio Conte to succeed. But I do think injuries aside, I do think that's quite strange where he's got a big tune out of Davis and Dyer last season, and this season it just feels like they've dropped off again. Maybe that's just the standard of player that they can't raise their game again, because Romero got booked pretty early on, didn't he, yesterday? But then I thought he was outstanding again. I thought, some of them tackles he was making on a yellow card as well, one in particular in the penalty area. So there was a big fix to happen. And I just feel, I don't know what you lads think, I just feel if we get rid of Conte now, or allow him, if we can use that word, allow him to leave, we're just going to go through the same painful process again, regardless of what the manager is, because we have to go through that process in order to get better. Arsenal, 2 8th place finishes under Arteta, bottom of the league last season. Now we'll look at where they are. They went through that pain. In fact, didn't they offer him a new contract whilst he was still going through some tough times? So I just think it is about backing where we are at right now and making sure that I don't think the club or Conte, well, club definitely haven't because they don't come out, but I don't think the club or Conte has ever come out and said, we don't want to be here to each other. He alludes to them sorts of things, but he also says, I like working at Tottenham, I want to be here. So it's kind of like, it's so confusing, isn't it? I mean, I don't know where to go from it because it's so confusing.
Can you shed any light on that? Yeah, I mean, Dan, can you shed any light on the confusion with regards to maybe these errors? I mean, the errors maybe firstly. Yeah.
I appreciate what Lee's saying. I would say there's less confusion in my mind. I mean, I think if Conte really wanted to be here, he would have signed a new deal. Spurs would have been happy with that earlier in the season. Maybe they might not be so happy about it now, given the way the form's going. But let's be clear. I think Conte is the one, as much as anything, who is driving this uncertainty. He did it last season. For the duration of the second half of the campaign, he refused to commit beyond the end of the season, even though he had another year on his deal. He had talks after the Norwich game when Spurs clinched Champions League football, as you remember, and then he agreed to stay on for another year. But until that point, it was not guaranteed. And I think last season, the fact that he could walk away was kind of a motivator for his players. I think he was such an asset to the club. And this year, I don't think it is motivating them anymore. I think it's seeding uncertainty. So, yeah, I see where you're coming from. But I think, sometimes you have to kind of think about what the top line or what the key message is. And for me, the key message he keeps repeating is that he could walk away at the end of the season. And yet, yes, you're right. He does say, I'm enjoying working here, and I'm enjoying the project, and I understand the project, and I know that what the conditions are, that kind of thing. But he also won't stop saying, he said it again last night, that he still has to decide his future. So for me, as much as I think Conte is clearly a world-class manager, I mean, that's beyond dispute. He is making it very, very difficult for the club. And I know a lot of fans don't want to hear this, but to use a hackneyed analogy, if your girlfriend kept threatening to leave you, you would not be buying her, many expensive gifts to convince her to stay. Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't, because you'd be worried you're wasting your money. And I feel like, by the same token, probably part of the hesitance for the club to really get behind Conte is because he keeps saying, I might not be here next season. So there's obviously a case for them to say, well, I'm not sure we should be buying you kind of specialist players for your very rigid system that you refuse to change. We've kind of got where I thought we would get. So I'd be interested to hear you guys' thoughts. I mean,
you come back on that. I'll come after.
Yeah, sorry, but just to interact on that. So again, I get what you're saying. Completely get what you're saying, and it does feel like a chicken and egg scenario. The girlfriend analogy is brilliant, by the way, because unless that individual, your partner, whatever's going to commit, then why would you commit? But equally, it's got to. Why has it got to this stage? When Antonio Conte took the job 18 months ago, there would have been a plan with the board, with Paratici, with his new staff, and Antonio Conte and his coaching staff. And whatever that plan was, which we never got to hear, by the way, we got, I think, a snippet in February, maybe from Fabio Paratici saying this is where we want to go. But other than that, we didn't really know what that plan looked like. It's going to be a 5-year plan before we win the Premier League, or it's going to be a 2 to 3 year plan before we. There's no, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with putting a stake in the ground and saying, right, this is what we're building up to, but it's going to take some time. And therefore, what's changed from that point when he signed to now? And actually sometimes, and a lot of the frustration I think from a lot of people with the board is that they constantly, or the board have constantly not given the managers what they want or what they need. And Conte is the first manager in I don't know how long to actually call them out on it. He's the first person to actually be almost like a voice for a lot of the frustrated fans to go, we do need to spend more money. Manchester United have spent 400 million. We haven't spent enough, or we've recruited in the wrong ways. And so I just wonder what, and this is a point about the communication from the top, like what's changed during that period? Forget the results, because I don't think anybody expected after the Nuno situation and us being 8th in the league, I don't think any of us expected us to get top 4. So the fact that we've got top 4 in Champions League football and the revenue, by the way, that goes with that, massive bonus. And ultimately to be able to attract players. I don't think Perisic would have come, for example, if we weren't in the Champions League. And you might argue that he's not good enough after their mistakes yesterday. But again, that's another debate. But the point I suppose I'm making is that what's changed from Conte signing to now outside of the football arena. And therefore, that's the bit that because that's what everyone's guessing. Oh, it must be money. Conte's got the ump because he's not getting backed. That's the general consensus. But we actually don't know if that's the case, do we?
I think, again, totally fair point. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that Conte has said on record that the situation at the club was worse than he realised. So my theory is that there's sort of 2 elements to it. One is that Conte, when he took the job, he was fed up of being out of football. He got a very attractive financial package from Spurs. And he probably thought the situation was closer to the situation he walked into at Chelsea when they just had the Mourinho season and it was a really talented squad who'd just been undercoached. When actually the reality is that Spurs are a really imbalanced squad, as we know, with a lot of players that need moving on and upgrading. that's a lot harder to whip into shape than that Chelsea team was. Apologies, my baby daughter's screaming in the background. I don't know if you can hear
I
that.
thought Macca was maybe looking at me. What mine this time, Macca?
Well, mine are not babies anymore, so they're at school.
But then I also think, as we know, ENIC and Daniel Levy have a history of seemingly not giving the managers what they want, and pretty much every manager from certainly from Harry onwards to Poch, I think has more or less said we didn't get the targets we wanted. And you could see that play out in the summer with Conte, who obviously wanted Bastoni at centre half and ended up with Longley on loan, as one example. Clearly didn't want Jed Spence. We're not sure. I'm not exactly sure who he wanted at right wing back, but clearly it wasn't Spence. That's obvious. And so presumably he feels like he's been let down, and he would have thought that the club would kind of be more robust and ambitious in the market. So I think there are two elements. When you say it changed, I think Conte maybe walked into a situation that was worse than he realised, and actually it doesn't strike me. You guys may disagree, but it doesn't strike me that he really has the appetite for the rebuild. He says he does, but he looks like a man who, frankly, doesn't really want to be there.
He looks a bit broken at the moment.
He looks worn out, and obviously he's had this, an immense amount of personal tragedy this season, which would take its toll on anyone. But it looks like the job is kind of draining him, and it is harder than he realised. But equally, I think, from what we know about how the club operates, it just doesn't look like they've followed through on their promises to kind of rebuild the squad in his image. I think there's probably been too many compromises. I think Spence was probably a compromise. I think Longley probably was. It doesn't look like he really fancies Basuma, does it? So, yeah.
Sorry, Rick, just quickly. The Basuma one's very interesting because I think all of us, or a lot of us, certainly 90% of us, wanted Basuma. Didn't see it coming. It was kind of a little bit kind of left field, if you like. I remember I was in London that day. All of a sudden, I was like, "What? We've signed?" I think it was Gary Jacobs broke the story, didn't he? And said, "Oh, we've got Basuma." I was thinking, really? And a £60 million player, really, because the last year in his contract, 35 million, raising it to, and he's just been a shadow of himself. I mean, this guy bossed games in Brighton, and again, is that again a kind of a thing with Conte, whereby because he doesn't fancy him, it wasn't his signing. He doesn't want him, or he coaches the life out of him. He tells him to do something different, like we've seen with Spence. I mean, again, I'm making an assumption there. Of course, it's a question really than a statement.
Well, I think there is a history of centre midfielders in particular struggling to get up to speed with Conte's game and the way he wants to play. I mean, Eriksen was a great example at Inter Milan. It took him half a season to be trusted by Conte and get in the team. Fabregas was a good example at Chelsea. He barely played in the first half of the season, and he became really important. So you could argue that Basuma is just kind of going through that process of being Contified. But equally, again, I just feel like there's far too many players in the squad that haven't improved or look undercoached to me. Again, you may disagree, but Basuma is certainly one of them. The way he ran games at Brighton, including 2 games last season that I saw live against Spurs, when he was just looked like the perfect signing in the summer. And it's easy to forget he's barely had a kick, has he?
I must ask you, Dan, just if I can come in there. Really good point from Vinny on the screen, who says this isn't fair to the fans, though. The club won't sack someone who doesn't want to be there, and the manager won't resign for the same reason. So it feels like, Dan, that we're at a bit of an impasse, if I put that in the most polite way at the moment, where something has got to give. And obviously there's a section of fans that feel Spurs have gone with 2, if I use that term, win now managers in Conte and Jose. And obviously they feel, and I am partly in this bracket as well, that they haven't been sufficiently backed in terms of giving them the actual tools that they need in order to be successful. So this is what I think frustrates a lot of fans, is that why would you go for a win now manager approach if you're not, they're going to give them the tools. If you know you can only go for a project manager, then go for a project manager and build something from the start like we've done under Pochettino, because we may as well have given the rebuild to Poch rather than going down the route of Jose and Conte, because it does feel like we're just going to end back up in the same situation that we will do. And it's only a hunch, I might be completely wrong. I feel that we're going to grovel back to Poch because Poch will, I think, appease a percentage of the fan base that just want to see good football again. Because I think we're at a point now where we can stomach losing, because we've been losing for how many years and not winning trophies. But if you're not seeing the football either, I mean, it's quite literally soul destroying as a fan, because you're not getting either of anything to enjoy. So, yeah, I mean, on that point, do you understand? Obviously, I presume you do understand that frustration of fans. And it just baffles me how we're now in the 20th day of a transfer window and we're maybe buying players that we're not even sure the manager's going to be for. How have we got to this point, Dan? How have we got to this point when you look at the World Cup? And, you know, for me, something had to have been decided before we restarted.
I agree.
Either he was going to sign or he wasn't going to sign, and we're going to have a change of tack. The fact that we are now middle of January and there's an uncertainty about the manager when we've got a Champions League doubleheader to come against AC Milan, where Spurs are still in the FA Cup, where conceivably, despite the improvement of the teams this season, they could still finish in the top four, you'd argue, if the players were to up their game. How have we got to this point, Dan?
Yeah, again, I can't disagree with anything you've just said. I mean, to go way back, I think the Mourinho appointment was probably about Levy thinking there's still enough in this squad for a win-now manager, as you put it, to drag them over the line to a trophy. You know, he correctly identified that the squad had gone stale under Poch and thought it was an easier route to get a new manager in than to rebuild under Poch. And probably he looked at Kane and Son being two of the foremost strikers in Europe and thought, hold on, if we get Jose in, he might be able to drag this kind of crumbling squad, you know, to an FA Cup or to you know, the
League Cup final, Dan, which he then got sacked 6 days before. I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, you're right. He nearly got there. So I think that was from the Mourinho appointment, but it's just muddled thinking, Ricky, like completely. And I think that there were many people. You know, I'm not saying I was one of them. I was very excited by the Conte appointment, but there were many people that kind of correctly predicted that this was not particularly. This was not a natural union. You know, Spurs and Conte. And I think.
Can I ask you, Dan, just coming on that point, but I thought many people thought, you know what, this is the first time in 19 years that Spurs are actually going to change their tact. They have learnt from Jose and they're bringing Antonio in because there's going to be a change of culture. They're going to bring in a manager that is used to winning and they're actually going to give him exactly what he needs to win. And as we've just said here, you look back at the summer business, clearly, and again, I'm not wanting to assume or speculate here, but Spence, as Conte is quoted and said on record, was a club signing. Clement Longley, as we know, wasn't his first choice because ideally the club identified Bastoni and maybe as one of many profile players they wanted. So, but the fact that already in the summer he didn't have what he wants, it just really disturbs me that we are where we are right now. And we're in the middle of a January window where, as I've said, I'm going to ask you about targets, but I feel like it's illogical. I feel like it's crazy I'm asking you about targets where I don't even know what manager we're buying them for, Dan. I just can't understand how we've come to the point that we've come to now when we clearly knew when we researched and looked at Antonio Conte what he would want. And the most horrendous thing about all this as well, Dan, is that we actually went up to him before. We went and approached him before this and he turned us down. So to go back for the second time now and then actually appoint him and then still not identify and understand what the guy needs, I find that mind-boggling, Dan. Is that fair to find that mind-boggling?
Yeah, I think it's fair. You know, and it comes down to the same thing. You know, it's muddled thinking and muddled leadership at the top. I think, you know, ENIC have done a lot of good for the club, and certainly the bigger picture in terms of where they've raised. You know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like just about before and it came in, and it wasn't particularly great. But I think they are an investment company, and the shareholders will always be the priority of ENIC. That's just indisputable. That is what they are there for. They are an investment company designed to make their shareholders money. Sometimes the interests of the shareholders align with the interests of the club. Sometimes they don't. So it's not as if, without outside investment, it's just not as if Levy was ever going to dramatically change his business model. I think that was probably wishful thinking on behalf of supporters. That's not to say that Spurs aren't spending well since they got the stadium, because they are.
Can I ask you, Dan, just to quickly come back in there, then, do you think then, based on what you were saying about maybe wishful thinking, was there a thinking then that Conte was going to adapt and maybe lower his expectations, where he was going to come into a club that it was going to be more of a project rather than winning now? Because the way Conte is always...
clearly, Conte keeps saying, I know what my challenge is here, and it's not to win the league and Champions League this season. It's to build a solid foundation for future success. But, it's... Conte has had a lot of money spent for him as well. I mean, again, relative to what Chelsea are doing now, it doesn't seem like a lot. But I think Spurs spent 130 million in the summer, something like that. I mean, Richarlison alone was 60, Basuma was 20 odd, Spence 15. I'm forgetting someone. So, and then Bentancur and Kulusevski at the end of the window as well. So I think the club would say, we are spending more money than we were before. We moved to the new stadium. That's what we promised. But again, I do agree with you that it's not enough to satisfy Conte, and certainly it's not the kind of dramatic change that I think some supporters hoped for when he came in. But as I said, I don't think that's was ever a kind of realistic expectation.
Lee, I want to bring you back in, but I've got a couple more questions I want to ask Dan on the man. Do you want to go, Lee, or do you want to come in first? Anything you want to ask Dan from your end? I'm just conscious. I don't know how much longer we can do on the manager and the ball before we do move it on. So anything more you want to say?
I think it's quite interesting in comparison, because there's no doubt, and I said on last night's show, and I say it again, it's always a series of things that happens that make a disaster. It's not one thing. So it's not Antonio Conte, it's not the board, it's not the Ricky, it's not Dan Kilpatrick because he gets paid and he doesn't. It's not one thing. It's lots of different things. And one of the things that I think is a little thing that's happening this year, really little, is the fact that Arsenal are top of the league. And when you look at Arsenal, they were way behind us under all of the Poch days, way behind us. Not only have they managed to claw themselves back above us into a situation where they're now miles ahead of us, just in almost like one season. And that's because seemingly there was big pitchforks coming out at Arsenal, lots of protests going on. Only a couple of seasons ago, sacked the manager, he was bottom of the league, all of that sort of stuff. The same thing was happening really at Arsenal. Go and ask their fans, as is happening today. They got rid of Emery, and they wanted to get rid of Arteta at some point. When they were bottom of the league, probably under, when we were top and they were bottom. And now look at how that's changed. And that's because the club is aligned, from top to manager to recruitment to fans to everything about that football club is like what we had to a certain degree, because I've touched on the 518 days under the Pochettino era, and that comes back to that culture and that. But we were on the same page. We had stuff to look forward to, Dan and Ricky. We were looking forward to a world-class stadium. We were looking forward to playing some games at Wembley. We were getting record crowds in Champions League, 88,000. We've got these records. We were looking forward, and then to be in this position after building that world-class stadium, after getting all that revenue in, after getting all that money, financial fair play is not an issue. So the frustrations of some of the fans will be, the only issue is that we've let all these other clubs overtake us. Look, Man City's, Chelsea's, whatever, they've always been ahead of us. Liverpool, we finished above Liverpool before the Klopp era 9 times out of 10 seasons. We finished above them, in terms of Liverpool. Liverpool have then gone on to have their sliding doors moment with Dejan Lovren getting rinsed, ironically, by Kane at Wembley, 4-1 defeat. Sliding doors moment. They invested heavily in the squad. They won the lot, literally everything since that period of time. We as fans of Tottenham Hotspur are we're kind of used to losing, right? So we're used to not winning stuff, so that we're hardened to that. But what I don't think we can take is the fact of there's nothing. What is the plan? There's nothing coming out of the club. What is there to look forward to? That's the biggest issue where I think everything's floating about. And Arsenal being top of the league and not only being top of the league, but miles ahead of us, and us seeing where they were only 2 seasons ago is even more infuriating. Does that make sense, lads? Listeners, viewers?
I think that makes total sense. And I think the particularly infuriating thing is Arteta was appointed the month after Poch was sacked, I think. I think he was December 2019. Poch was November 2019. And it just makes you think, this is the season where Liverpool are stuttering, Chelsea are in a rebuild, United aren't quite there yet, they're still in transition, Man City look like they might fall away. And had Spurs backed Pochettino then, or even if for whatever reason they felt that he was burnt out and they needed a new project coach, had they brought in a new project coach then and backed them, they would now potentially be in a position to do what Arsenal are doing. Had there been that vision and that determination to rebuild, they would now be in a place to capitalise on this kind of, one of those seasons that comes around every now and then. We all remember the Leicester season when we were not quite there, but Leicester were. This feels almost similar in that all the top clubs have their own issues, and Arsenal, obviously are a member of the Big Six, but they're the ones that are primed to take advantage of that, and Spurs are nowhere near. And it's just, it's just so frustrating that for me the biggest mistake Levy has made of a catalogue of big mistakes was just not listening to Pochettino and thinking that he knew best and thinking that somehow he was part, as big a part of the reason for the club's success as Poch had been, which was just frankly untrue. It was all about Poch and the way he developed that culture, and as Lee alluded to, the kind of thread of unity that ran through the club from the terraces, through the manager, through the team, to the boardroom. It was a really special time, and that should have been continued. And if for whatever reason either party felt they couldn't continue that, then it should have been the same model with a different project coach, not a Mourinho or a Conte, and certainly not a Nuno. And then had that happened in November 2019, Spurs would actually be a month ahead of Arsenal in the project. But instead, it feels like they're years behind Arsenal now.
I'm conscious that we've nearly done 50 minutes on the manager and the board. And I think we just kind of need to get to a point where we just maybe I'll have to ask you some hard-hitting questions and to close this segment before we move on very quickly. I'm conscious it is a Friday night. I think all of us can't wait to have a break and mentally get away from the Spurs for the weekend. Yeah. It's just one of those weeks where just quite frankly, what is this club doing to us? Right. So Dan, it looks like based on obviously the conversations that we've had here, being honest, as what we can see, it feels like there's a bit of an impasse at the moment. So where does this end, Dan? If that's it's probably a hard maybe question to ask you. Where does this go right now? I mean, we're 20 days into the window. Spurs haven't yet done any business, which we're going to come on to in a couple of minutes. But do you think Conte will be there come the end of the season at this rate, based on the alarming form?
I think I don't want to make predictions because I genuinely think it's a mug's game, so I just avoid predictions. I think there's 2 things to consider. I think one is that Conte has had a very tough year, as he's spoken about recently, and that has to be taken into account. He's lost 3 close friends. He's living in a hotel away from his wife and daughter. He doesn't look particularly happy. He's struggling. Yeah. I think given that, at the end of the season, there could be a handshake between him and Levy that suits both sides, where he says, I'm struggling. I need to go back to Italy. It's not about you. And Levy says, well, I'm not going to trigger the option we've got for 12 years, for 12 more months, because
12 years we'll be lucky with a manager for 12. Imagine 12 years with a manager. I could 12 years
say, I mean, that's probably what he needs to rebuild the squad. To be fair,
probably needs 12 years and the rest, and then another 12 on that. Dan, I tell you.
Yeah. So I could see. I think that's one potential scenario where they kind of part ways at the end of the season, and it's kind of mutually beneficial in that Conte probably feels he can't see it through. I guess the other thing to consider is Levy obviously wants Champions League football. I mean, everyone wants Champions League football next season. It's it's a big part of the business plan. It's where Spurs feel they should be. I think personally, if you look at the run of fixtures after the next game against City, so I think it's Fulham, Preston, City again, then there's a run of fixtures where I think I'm right in saying Spurs have Chelsea at home and basically the bottom six and the Champions League doubleheader in there. So you could make a case that if you were Levy, you might be looking at that two ways, thinking either that's a chance for Conte to turn it round, or that's a chance for a new manager bounce to win 5-6 games out of 7 and catapult the club back into top 4 contention and maybe a Champions League quarter-final. Now, I'm not saying that's based on any info, to be clear, that Spurs want to sack Conte. I'm saying that is one way that you could look at literally the fixture list.
Yeah.
So I think those are two scenarios. The other scenario is obviously Spurs have a much stronger second half of the season, just as they did last season, maybe scrape 4th place. And then you get another situation where Conte might think, hold on, I'm paid very well. I've got some good players here. We're back in the Champions League. Maybe I've won the FA Cup and continues. I personally find it hard to see that third scenario playing out. It just feels like no one really is committed enough on either side, on his side, on the club side. That's my personal opinion again. So yeah, those are the kind of options, I guess.
Before Maka comes back in there, Dan, one final thing I want to ask you is that, look, it was clear, it seemed, in between that World Cup break, there was negotiations of a new contract. Just to maybe ask you a straight question, you may not know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you. If you don't know the answer, it's fine, of course. Do we know if there's even an offer still of a contract to sign for Conte as things stand now? Do we know if there's a contract on the table still offering Conte to pen long term to the club?
It's a good question. And the answer is I don't know if there's an offer still on the table. I mean, I think you can probably make your own educated deductions about that. I mean, the form has not been great. It's obviously 6 defeats in 10 league games. So I'd kind of be surprised if the club was saying to any manager in that situation, we want, here's a bumper new contract. Although, having said that, if they feel that the uncertainty Conte is causing by not committing beyond the end of the season is a big issue, then, it might be in their interests. But yeah, I don't know for sure, Rick.
Okay, that's fine. Lee, any more on this subject before we move on?
Just quickly on that. Again, I just want to, it's only just a balance and a context around everything that we've been talking about. And I do agree that the most likely scenario, like you just said, Dan, is that they kind of part ways and say thanks for your time, because he does look broken in that press conference. His family is still in Italy. He has gone through a horrendous time personally this year with losing 3 people, exactly what you've just said. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't think we appreciate, and we should appreciate, because when you lose a loved one or, a top family person or, a friend, it affects you and it affects your work. And your boss, where you work, will need to know that sort of stuff as well. When it happens 3 times within that period of time, or like a short period of time, that must be really hard, especially with everything else that's going on as well. But just to put some context around it, Jonathan Ville, one of your colleagues, really, that is on the circuit with you, Dan, he tweeted earlier from the PA, isn't he, from the press association? He tweeted earlier the league table after 20 games for Tottenham last season versus the league table after 20 games for Tottenham this season, and it's absolutely compelling viewing, right? Because we're 7th in the league with 36 points last season. This season we're 5th with 33 points. So all the stuff that's gone on, all the doom and gloom, where we are, we're still actually only 3 points behind where we was this time last season. And therefore, if we get another Bentancur, it's a big if we get another Bentancur and Kulusevski, if we do have our second half kick-on season, there's no reason why we can't. I mean, he is the reason. Bentancur is the reason why we're playing on Wednesdays as we sing. And there's no reason why we can't go again and get into that top 4. I just feel maybe this is hope rather than expectation. There's very different. The sentimental part of me, the hope part of me, I just hope that we do stick with Conte and that Conte does want to be here. Because I honestly think that if he does want to be here and we do stick with him, I think in the next couple of years we could be very good. That's what I think. I just think bringing in another manager today, if it was the board's choice just to sack Conte, even if he wanted to stay, I think that would be a mistake, because bringing in another manager, we're going to have to go through the same process again. Like, we literally are going to have to go through, unless, like you said earlier, Rick, it becomes Poch. Because Poch is the only guy, the names that we've been talking about, that kind of knows the club inside out, knows the fans, knows everything that's happened before. And it does feel like that he could maybe seamlessly just come in and pick up where he left off.
I'll tell you what, Lee, just on that point, and Dan, again, with your position, I'm not sure if you want to comment on this, and I understand if you don't, but it always would feel then for Daniel that he's almost having to swallow a lot of pride there to bring Maurizio back, as if to say, I've got this wrong. And I can't remember in the 20 years ENIC have been here that we've had at any point, and please correct if I'm wrong here, guys, I can't remember Daniel ever coming out and saying, I've got this badly wrong, we should never have done this. And almost bringing Maurizio back would be an indication that we should really have never sacked him in the first place. Maybe. And backed him at the time when he demanded new furniture.
I agree with you, Ricky, in that I think there is a question over whether Levy would be kind of prepared to sort of swallow his pride on it, particularly as Poch has been spectacularly proved right in the last kind of 3 odd years. But then I would also say that Levy has a pretty strong history of bringing people back to the club, doesn't he? I mean, Bale.
Right, he does.
He's not averse to bringing someone back. And I actually think for me that the more interesting question would be whether Poch and Paratici would both be prepared to work together.
I'm not going to ask you to comment, Dan, but after the news of Paratici today, God knows where that bloke is at the moment.
Well, I was going to say,
I'm glad you're going to ask me about that. Let's keep it that way.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to comment, but everyone's asking, where is the bloke? We're 20 days into a window. Right, what we are going to do is we are going to go for our first break of the show for our listeners and audio. I'm conscious that we're nearly over an hour in. It is a Friday here. For all of our own sakes, we're not going to keep Dan too long. We're just going to obviously give a quick overview, obviously, of where we are with regards to the transfer window. I can hear the laughter track in the background because we're 20 days in and we haven't even done anything yet. So people are thinking, what are you talking about, transfer windows? Is there even one open? There is actually one open at the moment. Lots of teams quite a number of teams are doing their business. Dan, I'm going to ask you about the situation with regards to Pedro Porro. I'll let Lee ask you about Zaniolo as to where we're at. Let's start with Porro quickly, Dan. Look, seems to be a player that Spurs admire. They seem to like him. Spurs fans, and me included, will be thinking, well, if you are wanting to back Antonio Conte, there's the release clause. Just go and pay the release clause and bring him in. So what is making this move so difficult, Dan, to complete when we're 20 days into a window and you can see the clear deficiencies that Spurs have in that back line?
Well, I think, first of all, Porro is the kind of name out there at the moment, but we all know by now like how Paratici likes to work. He tends to be spinning plates. That's pretty common knowledge. So it may well be that there are sort of other wing-back targets that we don't know about, that I don't know about. So that might be part of the hesitation on pulling the trigger on Porro in case someone more attractive presents themselves in the last 10 days of the window, which as we know is how the club like to operate. They like to let it go down toward the wire to try and get a better deal for themselves. I had heard Conte has concerns that Porro might be a bit slight. I think that's been reported elsewhere. He likes his full wing-backs, to be physical players. It's no secret that he liked the idea of converting Adama Traore, for instance, to the role a year ago. So that gives you an idea of maybe the kind of profile that he's looking for there. So it may well be that there's also a sense that not everyone is completely sold on Porro. And then to go back to what I said earlier, I guess the hesitation on the club side might be, well, hold on a minute, are we going to buy a player for a manager who might not be here next season, or who's threatening to not be here next season, because the new manager if Conte was to leave at the end of the season, might not rate Porro. So those are my hypotheses for the delays. I think there is a sense in the last few days that it's gathered momentum. Spurs have entered talks. I think they've made offers. I think they've suggested players in part exchange to see if Sporting are interested in that. And there's a kind of new impetus on trying to do that deal. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think another thing to consider, and I've written this, is that there doesn't seem to be any appetite from Emerson or Doherty to go. I was told Emerson does not want to leave London. He'd only go to a London club as it stands in the Premier League. So that's a problem because who wants him?
Chelsea, maybe? They're buying everyone else at the moment.
I mean, the way it's going, it would be worth a shot, wouldn't it, to offer him to Todd Bowley? But I think what has been overlooked occasionally this season, including in the chat about Spence, is that actually Conte's got a squad to manage, and he probably won't want 3 senior right wing backs, even if he thinks he can get an upgrade there. So yeah, that's my kind of best hypotheses about the Porro situation. But yeah, from what I've heard, it has sort of gathered pace in the last few days. So we wait and see where that goes.
Okay, Lee, I'll let you come in on there.
I was going to ask you about Zaniolo, but we've had some pace gathering in the comments. I haven't seen any social media stuff, so I don't know if you got any updates from us on that, Dan, at all. But it looks like that's starting to gather pace as well in terms of Zaniolo, and actually, is he going to come and join the football club?
I don't know anything about that. The first time I heard that Zaniolo interest had been reignited, I think, was on the way to City last night, and obviously I haven't really had a spare moment to try and stand it up. I mean, what I can say is it's just he's a name that's been around for forever, hasn't he? I mean, it definitely dates back to Mourinho, that alleged interest. And sometimes, in my kind of experience, sometimes there are sort of club targets who stay on the radar for a long time. And sometimes there are just players with kind of quite active agents who constantly mention the same clubs when they're talking to people. So I honestly don't know. What was he mooted as a kind of wing back, if I remember rightly?
He was at one point, yeah.
Sure, but I think this season he's going to be more of a kind of that forward player. Do you know what I mean? Like, I listened to I can't remember his name. I'll get it back. I'll come back to my memory banks. But I listened to him on Sky, Andy, the European football expert, Andy Brazil, good guy. And he was saying that actually it went before he done his second, because he's done 2 cruciate ligaments, right? And I know I play football, right? But I've done my right one twice, so I know how bad it is. And he's done one in his left knee and one in his right knee. So he's only 23 years old. Used to be powerhouse, big, strong guy, but run past people. But actually, Andy was explaining that now he doesn't explode and doesn't go past people as much as what he used to. And of course, he's not playing as much under Jose, because Jose's got Dybala there, isn't he? He's got Tammy Abraham that's firing on all cylinders as well. So he's not playing. I think there's another player, I can't remember, who plays up top. But so he's getting bit parts. So it could be an opportunity, and we know that Paratici likes an opportunity, don't we? But equally, if he's it's in the comments, is he another Lamella? Plays once, has a good game, and then has 5 out because he's injured. I mean, it does.
I won't hear a bad word against Lamella.
I was about to say, I know Dad from years ago. Dad was listen, we all had a bit of love for Lamella back in the day.
So did I. But it's that sort of thing, isn't it, where you think, are we going to get a run of 20, 30 games out of him? But I think I also, it's trying to put into context. It's not really a question to you, Dan or Ricky. It's just more of a kind of, are we in this state because we haven't signed anybody? Because this time last season, and we got Bentancur and Kulusevski, we also hadn't signed anyone. So is the delay because Conte won't sign a new contract, or is the delay because Tottenham are Tottenham and this is what we do forever? Because we didn't sign anyone early in January last year. And actually, Conte mentioned in his presser today that he was a bit perturbed by the fact that we let 4 people go and only brought 2 in. And I remember at the time when he was saying that, I was thinking, what, you're that worried about letting Lo Celso go and Dembele go and Winks go and Dele Alli go, because they were the 4. but it was a numbers thing for him at that period. And he talked about that today, and the fact that we got the 2 in that were brilliant, but we didn't get them in at this point in the season. I think it was at least another 6 days away before they signed. So is that just Tottenham?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of column A, bit of column B, isn't it? I mean, it is just Tottenham. They prefer to leave it late. It's just pretty much always been the way the club's operated. But I think it's reasonable to assume that the Conte doubt is giving them a bit of pause for thought.
Yeah, it's fair. I agree. You wouldn't sign, would you? I mean, like, again, if you're going for a new role, and your CEO or whatever that you've interviewed with, you built relationship with, you're there, the boss, whatever it is, and he or she's like, yeah, brilliant, you're coming in, but by the way, I'm going to leave. You're kind of not going to go though, are you? You're going to feel like, hang on, really, what's going to happen then? So it's very uncertain. That's why I think I tweeted this back before the World Cup. The key 4 things for me, it was before the Brentford game. The key 4 things for me was announce Antonio Conte and Conte's contract extension, announce Kane, because I think once Conte extends, then Kane extends. That's just my opinion, and get them deals done. And that is seriously feel-good factor coming back from the World Cup. And then make sure that you got your core targets for the January window lined up. Get 3 points against Brentford. I mean, it's quite simple, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, to do that. I know there's a lot of complications that I don't know about, but actually, if you do that, we're in a very different scenario than we are as we're talking today. And now we're in a situation where Kane's going to leave because he's in his less than 18 months of his contract. Conte's going to leave. Son's had a shocker. He can't even be sold now for 20 million because he's so bad. It's just so erratic, isn't it? The whole thing.
That's the word. That is the word. Dan, I think what we'll do is that I say a couple of final things to ask you about. I'm maybe going to ask you about Lloris's situation. I think maybe Lee rightly maybe ends it on Harry and maybe the situation around him to close it. But I mean, you mentioned I think earlier in the piece that Spurs are working on a succession plan and targeting a new goalkeeper as a priority in the summer. Now, I think among those targets you named were David Raya, Jordan Pickford, and Jana Black as the potential targets for Tottenham. Based on Hugo's form, and I know, again, I want to make this point. You did a piece with Hugo. I think, was it today, Dan, or yesterday?
Today.
Do you maybe want to bring that into context? I think, Dan, again, it's one of those interviews where I saw the minute you put it out on Twitter, and we know what Twitter's like. It obviously was heavily, again, ridiculed, the fact that, with Lloris, the amount of errors he's making. And to be fair, again, I'll say it. I think my stance as a fan looking at this is that Spurs should have been having Lloris's successor probably 2 years ago. I think we should never have been at a point where we are now, where we're having to replace Lloris at a point where he's making error after error after error. And I think it's so sad that for a guy that's given over 10.5 years of service, that we're seeing almost a fall away from the guy that's recovered so many points for Tottenham over so many seasons, because he was ultimately one of the reasons why Spurs achieved the top 4 in that season against Arsenal, battling for the top 4. So do you think that succession plan will be accelerated, Dan, or what do you see with Lloris and maybe bringing the context you spoke about with him?
Yeah, I don't think it will be accelerated, but I wrote today in my piece about the defence that there's a strong case for accelerating it, I think, because you've got a situation where, frankly, he is costing Spurs a lot of points suddenly. We don't know how the Villa and Arsenal games would have gone if he hadn't made a mistake leading to the first goal in both. And I think, had Spurs kept it tight for the first 20 minutes of the second half last night, it could have been a very different outcome, and City would have got frustrated and left more space, etc., etc. And he was culpable, I think, for the first and third goals. So there's definitely a case to bring it forward. I don't think Spurs will, because I think, as we know, it is very difficult to sign players in the January window. You've got 10 days left. The players they will be looking at who are capable of coming in and being a number one at a top 6 Premier League club will already be the number one somewhere else. And there aren't going to be many clubs in Europe, unless Spurs make a massive offer, who are going to want to lose their goalkeeper with a few days left of the January transfer window. It just, who are they going to get? Everton aren't going to sell Jordan Pickford. Brentford aren't going to sell David Raya mid-season. I doubt Atletico Madrid are going to sell Jan Oblak. So it's and all of those guys have interesting contract situations, incidentally, and which might be easier to exploit in the summer. So yeah, I can't see it happening. Honestly, I may be wrong. And if Lloris's form continues to go south, then maybe Spurs will think again. But I think at the moment it's a priority for the summer. I agree with you, Rick. It should have happened before. But yeah, just to plug my piece very quickly, Lloris very decently fronted up last night. I was kind of in the mix zone, and there weren't any other journalists who wanted to speak to him down there, so I ended up just speaking to him one-on-one, only for a few minutes, to be clear. But he wasn't great on the form. He obviously he wanted to be optimistic and look ahead, but he was quite honest about his own situation, and he said he was lacking mental freshness for the World Cup. And I spoke to a friend of Lloris's a week or so ago who was saying that there was a feeling that he had found it particularly hard to come back from not only captaining France to a World Cup final defeat in agonising circumstances, but also then announcing his retirement from international football, which is a massive wrench for him. He's France's record caps holder. It's been a huge part of his career and life. So I think we do have to take those things into account. But also Lloris, how can I put this? He's the kind of guy that's got that supreme self-confidence, and I think that has got him to the top. You have to have that to be a top goalkeeper, but I don't think he's now either unwilling or kind of unable to sort of turn his kind of be introspective and sort of be critical of his own form. So he was keen to sort of defend his performances against Arsenal and City. I think they were mistakes. He sort of explained that he thought they were deflections, and it was difficult for him. So it was good that he fronted up. But I think Conte has a decision to make now, right, about whether he might just need to give him a week off and take him out of the firing line. Take him out of Fulham, and then you've got Preston, which he could reasonably drop for, and then he's had a couple of weeks off, maybe just to reset and refresh for the run-in. I mean, I don't think that would be the worst idea. He still is capable of making those saves that we know him for. We saw it last night in the first half, and we saw it against Arsenal. It's just the judgment and errors creeping into his game. Yeah,
it's tough. I mean, like I say, I just don't see how, like I say, he's had the most amount of errors apart. I think the most in the Premier League of a player. I just don't know how feasible that is to carry on and sustainable that is when we've got so many important games coming up for the football club, and also for him as well. It can't be easy. A guy that's been so loved by the fan base, it can't be easy to see a turn now where people are demanding that he be out the team. And I have to be honest and say that, if we continue to play him, I am worried how many more points Spurs will drop.
I mean, not being funny, I know people are going to batter me in the chat, right? So crack on, no problem. But Forster's got over 250 Premier League appearances, right? He's a good goalkeeper. When you've got your top goalkeeper that's making some mistakes, it's not as if Forster is utter rubbish as well. Although he wasn't brilliant, was he? When he did play, but again, it's because of running games. Like the confidence that you have. Like, I am not trying to tell Antonio Conte, far from it, how to manage a football team and a team environment. But I do manage teams, right? That's what I do. It's my job. I'm a CEO of a bloody business. I manage big teams, and sometimes you have to get everybody involved. He even said it in his press conference today. He said, to get that kind of synergy back, that excitement back with the group. Sometimes that is pulling Lloris out, putting Forster in and saying, look, you're going to make an impact for us now, Fraser, because we need you, and this is your time to shine. And there's nothing wrong with that. And he's not a rubbish goalkeeper. Like, he might come in and make horrendous mistakes, but you've just said he's that six errors leading to goals from Lloris. Can't be as bad as that at the moment. And like you said, Dan, get him out of the firing line for a bit. Maybe Conte's reluctant to do that because he feels the squad depth isn't there, and it comes back to the whole: has he been backed? Has he got the right squad depth? But it's baffled me with the same thing with Emerson Royale. I mean, to be fair to Emerson, he has left him out a couple of times. He's now put him back in. He scored. So you've got to give credit where credit's due in that scenario. But there was times with Emerson getting absolutely slaughtered, and it was almost like, I'm still going to put him in. Yeah, I'm still going to put him just to make a point about Spence. So I don't know whether there's an undercurrent there. That's just maybe Antonio's style, but I don't think there's anything wrong with taking Lloris out for a couple of games and and putting Forster in there.
Yeah,
I'm not
Lee,
saying Forster's a replacement, by the way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Lee, let's just close it with you with regards to Harry. Now we're going to let Dan go. Lee, want to close it with Harry, and we'll let Dan go.
I just Dan, your thoughts really on Harry. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that he done some sort of commitment to the club after the debacle of him wanting to leave. I'm very convinced of that. From information that I've had. And I was also very convinced that he would sign another contract. But I do believe, it's just my opinion, it's not inside information at all, but just my opinion is that the circumstances change in football very quickly. And with burning through yet another manager, I think we're going to also burn through Harry Kane. And I just wanted to see what your thought process on that, or if you're hearing anything. There was positive stuff when we were hitting top 4 in last season, and now it feels like to me that we've missed a boat.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece about this on Wednesday, my column for the paper, kind of addressing it, and I said it was Tottenham's elephant in the room, and I think an elephant in the room is an awkward subject that no one really wants to talk about, and that is kind of how it feels as a journalist. It's not a subject that the club want to engage in. Conte was asked about it this week. He said he didn't want to talk about it. I don't think there's a great deal from Kane's camp on this. So it's like no one's really talking about it. It's hard to know how Harry's feeling, but I think we can all make educated guesses, right? So it does feel like one of those issues that's just going to become more prominent as time goes on, really, as the season goes on, because my view is, and I wrote, I encourage people to read the column for the full picture of what I think, but it's hard to imagine Kane rushing into signing a new deal now. Why would he when there's so much uncertainty? And then he'll want to see, I guess, how it looks in the summer and at the start of next season. But the club then has a decision to make, because they do not want their most valuable asset entering the final year of his deal and potentially being able to walk away for nothing in summer 2024. So it's it's potentially a really unenviable position for the club and Levy, because they'll either have to take that risk or think about selling Kane, which would be I think gut-wrenching for most fans and kind of really feel like the end of something. I don't know whether the end of an era is the right phrase, but it would just feel like the death of something. I think, given his significance over the last decade and what he means to the club and the fans and his quality, obviously. So yeah, it feels like that's coming to a head for me. I would be very surprised if he signed a new contract before the end of the season. I think it would take something pretty dramatic, like Spurs kind of winning the Champions League, or all the form picking up dramatically. So yeah, I mean that's just another kind of consideration for everyone, on the board when they're making their next move, I think.
Yeah. Dan, listen, you give us an hour and a half of your time. Massively appreciate it. Dan, just to obviously let everybody know where they can find your content, what you provide to the Spurs community. Where can we find the wonderful work you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously in the paper, if you're in London, pick up the Standard. It is free. I write in there about Spurs, most days, certainly the day before every match and the day after every match. And then obviously I'm on Twitter at Dan_KP. So yeah, don't abuse me, but come and engage with me.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's just picked, and you've got to go with that, ain't you?
I must say that again. Listen, Dan's paid to have an opinion, and I have to say that he offers an opinion that I think is well worth taking consideration of, well researched, taking consideration of. Again, we have to appreciate the fact we've got journalists that's come on here, very high prominent journalist in Tottenham, has given us an hour and a half of his time. Dan, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Let's hope there's better things ahead. From Lee, from Dan, from myself, guys, please as always keep safe, keep well. We'll be back with you very, very soon. Have a good weekend and come